Is acrylic paint really the cheap knockoff of the art world? In today's video, we're going to discuss some of the myths behind acrylic paint. This video is inspired by an incendiary set of threads that basically said, hey, acrylic is worse than oil, let's talk about it. And I expected in the comments back there to be a little bit of discourse back and forth, but it really was kind of a dog pile as to why acrylic is a terrible medium. And I went into it pretty open-minded. I paint with acrylic, with oil, with gouache. I started my art account with watercolor. I teach all these different mediums. So I feel like a pretty versatile painter, and I don't mean just lightly dabble. My practice right now is pretty much 50-50 oil and acrylic. In fact, I'm going to reveal the medium of this painting at the very end of the video, so stay tuned to figure out which it is. Part of why I'm making this, if I can just show my personal bias here, is because I paint in so many different mediums. I have gone to many of art shows, art fairs, and have people confidently walk up, ask the medium. I say I paint 50-50 oil and acrylic. They assume which ones are which, and you would be surprised how often people are wrong. So in this video, I'm going to discuss the myths around acrylic paint, debunk them a little bit. I will say this is not me saying that acrylic paint is the best medium. All mediums are neutral. They are a product of someone's skill, time, dedication. And I think the beauty of being an artist is that anyone, if given enough time with any medium, whether it's mosaic, installations, an object, I think the true task of an artist is to take that medium and make the most of it, which is basically my whole argument in this video. Myth number one is that acrylic paint has only been around for 70 years. We don't know how it's going to last, therefore it's not archival. I always think this is a silly argument, especially because you will have people in the same breath make this argument and then say that part of why acrylic is bad is because it's made of effectively plastic, and plastic is going to be around forever, which I will say that latter point is perhaps the only valid argument. I'll get to that in a second though. So anytime anyone makes paint, it goes through rigorous testing. To briefly touch on what is paint, it is pigment, which the pigment is going to be the same whether it's gouache, watercolor, acrylic, oil, etc. And the thing that's going to differentiate it is the binder, basically the thing it's suspended in, because if you simply apply pigment with like water to canvas or paper, it will flake off. It's not stable. It has to be bound in something. Some of those tests are, for example, the blue wool scale test. This is basically tests the light fastness of the pigment. And again, this is across mediums. You have adhesion tests. This test checks to see how well paint adheres to different surfaces over time. Basically, it sees if it's going to be archival. You have the flexibility test, and acrylic paints always score off the chart on this, even compared to oil paint. You have the tensile strength test. This measures the strength and elasticity of the film created with the acrylic paint. The accelerated aging test, which is probably the most pertinent to this myth. And manufacturers use climate chambers to evaluate long-term aging. Aging isn't just time. Remember, we're measuring things like UV light, temperature, humidity, and they can simulate what aging will look like 100, 200, 500 years from now using these paints in a chamber. You also have the gloss and color retention test. This test measures how well the acrylic paint retains its original gloss and color intensity over time. So these paints go through rigorous testing. And look at it, acrylic, I think in a lot of ways ekes out oil paint. Both of them strive to create basically a film that is the protective layer. You also have things like varnish. There are ways to ensure longevity with your paint. As a working professional artist who sells my artwork to the public, I am always investigating how to maintain archival quality with both my acrylic and my oil paint. And I would say the slight edge that acrylic has even over oil paints is that with oil paint, in order to ensure that protective film that will hold up 50, 100, 200, 500 years, you have to have some knowledge of painting lean to fat. It's not prohibitively hard. Anyone, I think, could learn it. But if you're really new and maybe you don't have lean to fat mastered to create that perfect film, acrylic has the edge because you can paint lean to fat, fat to lean pretty chaotically, and the polymers are so solid that they'll hold up and have that archival quality even if you don't have all that great information. The next myth is a little bit more subjective, and that is that oil just looks better than acrylic, that acrylic can never look as good or as nice or as buttery or as colorful, insert whatever, adjective here, as oil paint. And this is a little bit tougher to argue in the sense that it's so subjective. Where my last myth, I was able to reach out to the artist in resident at Liquitex, who has a full-time scientist who is able to look through the questions and verify. This one is more my personal opinion. Now, on this aforementioned thread where people were dogpiling on acrylic paint, somebody pointed out that when fully cured, the refractive quality of something like linseed oil is higher than acrylic, acrylic, which is why acrylic appears flat despite the fact that the exact same pigment is used. And ever the science nerd, I really do love and nerd out on pigment and sort of the materiality of physical paint. But I went and I researched, and it appears that there's like a fraction of slightly more reflective quality in fully cured linseed oil. In fact, the exact reflective index of the linseed oil is 1.48, while the reflective index of acrylic polymer is slightly lower at about 1.41. So that is 0.07 of a difference, which is imperceivable to the human eye. Now, as someone who paints in both of these mediums, I can almost tell you what's going on here. So if the slight refractive difference is like a fraction of a fraction, why do so many people feel like acrylic paint is flatter? Because I don't want to gaslight people. I trust their opinions and that it feels flatter to them. What I think is happening is that whenever you are painting with acrylic paint, it is suspended in a polymer that is cloudy because the polymer reflects light in a like sporadic way. Basically, the same reason that milk is white is because it's reflecting wavelength so sporadically that it looks visually like white to us. It's that same thing that's going to happen with the acrylic paint. The thing that makes a color look lovely and juicy is sort of a transparent quality. That's why a lot of times transparent colors can really add a lusciousness to your paint palette. It almost has like a see-through, vibrant, jewel-like quality. But you don't get this in acrylic paint until after it's had the full time to dry. If you've ever bought acrylic mediums separately, like a gloss medium, you'll notice that it has like this white milky color, and that's because the polymers are structured so that they're scattering light. It's basically the same reason that milk is white, it's just scattering white wavelength. Whereas when you look at the medium for oil, which is basically linseed oil, it's yellowy but basically clear. So with oil, you get the effect of what it's going to look like fully cured while you're painting with it, but with acrylic, you have a flatter version until it fully dries, and then you get the full effect. But the kicker is, and I found this from both my research and of course my own personal experience, is so much of that luminescence actually has to do with the finish than it does the actual sort of paint quality. Again, they are different, but it's a fraction that is imperceivable to the human eye. However, when they tested having the acrylic paint varnished with a gloss that mimics the oily finish of a dried oil paint, tended to really bridge that gap, and it became a lot less perceivable which one was oil and which one was acrylic. And in my own personal experience, this is absolutely the case. Myth 2.5, acrylic is hard to make look rich and deep, and it always looks flat. I'm adding this on to the last myth because it's a continuation of the fact that acrylic looks flat, but I'm really focusing in on the technique here. It happens a lot when people sort of treat acrylic and oil application the same, because to my last point, they are structurally very similar and they can look really similar. But the fact is you have to sort of mix the same color over and over with acrylic paint, which can be frustrating. That's incredibly valid. But I would say that my ability in learning to paint with acrylics to mix the same color with almost perfect precision, because I've had to do it over and over, has made me a tremendously better painter. In fact, it's a skill that I carry over into my oil painting practice that's been incredibly helpful. There's certainly a lot more I could say on technique. If you guys want me to make a full video dedicated to it, please just ask and I would love to do so, because I think a further deep dive into the proper acrylic painting technique, especially if you're coming from oil, could be really helpful. And the last thing, technique, is that even though one could argue, especially if you come from an oil painting background, that in some ways acrylic is harder, I would say harder in the way that makes you better at painting, I don't think that this difference makes one medium better than the other, especially as a finished viewing experience. So we'll move on from this point. This brings us to truth number 1. I bet you didn't see that coming. Both oil and acrylic have waste that needs to be disposed of properly. With oil, it's going to be solvent, although in the thread, a lot of people argued that they don't paint with solvents, therefore a solvent-free oil practice is the most eco-friendly. And that I would largely agree with. Acrylic paint, if not disposed of properly, can get into the water and basically introduce microplastics into the water supply, which is really not great. My first argument, just like the you can sub solvents out for a solvent-free practice with oil, would be that you can paint with an acrylic practice and completely remove your acrylic water contamination. I've talked about this in my painting solvent-free oil video that I have linked in the show notes, but in my own practice, I use a mixture of wiping off my paint onto a drop cloth, which I then recycle and sell, along with the evaporation method and then the crash method in the wintertime to virtually mitigate all plastic exposure in the water. An advocate for responsible paint cleanup regardless of your medium. In fact, this extends to the rest of my life. For example, I have a filter on my washing machine because plastic that's in our clothing that is in the washing machine is a larger contaminant, simply by virtue of everyone wears clothes, and unfortunately a lot of clothes is made from plastic. But when we look at the data, the reality is that paint, including architectural, industrial, and fine art paints, accounts for less than 1% of the world's plastic waste. And fine art acrylic paint is just a tiny fraction of that already small number. It was hard to summarize this because I truly think each one of these points could be their own video, but I'm hoping you walk away with this with a little more context for acrylic paint and why I think it's a little bit of an unsung hero in the fine art world. As always, thanks for watching, and I'll talk to you guys in next week's video.